Where you feel like you are as a servant. I think, kind of like what we talked about at the table, we all kind of like to think of ourselves as servants. I like to think that I'm the kind of guy that would do anything for anybody. I like the sound of that. And I'd like to think that if somebody knocked on my door today and said, Gavin, I really need you to come over and do whatever, that I'd like to think I'd do it. The problem is that's not how service often works. In fact, very rarely does service walk up and knock on your front door and say, this is what I need today. Can you do it? Can you not? Sometimes that happens. But a lot more of service is having the love to go out of your way to serve. I'm not as good at that. I don't know about you, but I'm not near as good at that. We don't often think about God as a servant. We don't often think about God as being humble. In fact, it makes me a little uncomfortable to think about it. God is the creator. He's all-powerful. He has nothing to serve. He's the top of the food chain. He's as far up as it gets. And yet, throughout the Bible, we see God lower himself to serve his people. We see God being humble. John 13 is perhaps, outside of the cross, the most famous example of that. In John 13, we're going to see Jesus humble himself to wash his disciples' feet. And I think that's a story that a lot of us know, but Jesus has a lot to say about the reasons why he chose to do that, the implications of what that means for us. And I think sometimes we forget to go back through and actually apply the message that Jesus gave when he washed his disciples' feet. Because it's an amazing act on its own, but Jesus didn't leave it there. He said, here's what I want you to know about why I did this. So that's what we're going to look at today. Because we're going to see Jesus, the Son of God, God in the flesh, lower himself and go out of his way to submit and be humble and serve in a way that was far, far beneath what he deserved. And then Jesus is going to turn around and say, the reason I did this is because I want you to know that this is how my people are going to be. So we're going to analyze today, am I really serving the same way that Jesus served? And if not, why not? If you're with me in John 13, we're just going to start with reading the first 11 verses of this chapter. John 13, starting in verse 1. Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, when the devil had already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given him all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, do you wash my feet? And Jesus answered him, what I am doing you do not understand now, but afterward you will understand. And Peter said to him, you shall never wash my feet. And Jesus answered him, "If I do not wash you, you have no share with me." Then Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but my hands and my head also." And Jesus said to him, "The one who bathed does not need to wash except for his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not every one of you." For he knew who was to betray him, and that's why he said, "Not all of you are clean." So I think it's really helpful to start this look into this chapter with what John emphasizes from the very beginning over and over throughout this entire chapter, and that is Jesus knew he was about to die. That is the first thing John wants us to see. He brings it up in verse 1. He brings it up in verse 4. He brings up that he's about to be betrayed. At the end of this section, it's going to come up a lot. This is not an isolated incident. These are Jesus' last days on earth. This story takes place during what we would usually call the Lord's Supper. This is Jesus leaving his disciples with the sort of final things he wants them to remember or to know before his death. Which to me just underlines and bolds every single word that Jesus says here. This is important. This is what he wanted to leave his disciples with. Because Jesus knew what was coming. John wants you to know also in verse 2, or at the end of verse 1, that all of this is motivated by love. That's the other thing John emphasizes a lot in these first few verses. He loved his disciples. He loved them to the end. And the implication is everything we're about to read for the whole rest of the chapter is evidence of that love. John wants you to know there's going to be some confusing things in these next few verses. There's going to be some stuff that's really hard to wrap your mind around. And the answer key to all of those questions is this is an example of the love of Jesus that he had for his disciples. So that's what John really, really wants us to get. And that's important because what Jesus did here makes no sense. And I want you to really think about that. Again, this is one of those stories that we've all known, or at least a lot of us known for a long time. And maybe because of that, we forget how crazy this is. This is crazy. And I don't say that lightly. What Jesus did makes no sense. Jesus, at the very least, is a Messiah. He's a prophet. He's a great teacher. Of course, we know, and the disciples have been told, sometimes they seem to know, sometimes they don't, that he is the Son of God. Jesus is good, Jesus is holy, Jesus is perfect. And what Jesus does here is a slave's task. What Jesus does here is humiliating. It is self-deprecating. It almost hurts to read when you really think about it. I don't know about you guys. This is the kind of thing that affects me. When you see someone that should be the person being served, getting up and serving, like I don't know about you, but I always think of, you ever go to like lunch at your grandma's house and grandma spent like all afternoon and she was really cooking and slaving away in the kitchen, and then she insists that she's going to be last in the lunch line. Like, no, you need to get up here at the front. That almost hurts to see. Or what I think of a lot of times is it'd be summer, and I'd be sitting on the couch not doing anything, and I'd be wondering, like, where's my dad at? And I hear the lawnmower out in the backyard. That just kind of hurts. That's not supposed to be him out there. It's supposed to be me. That bothers me. For Jesus here, that is to an exponential degree that I just can't even fathom. That God in the flesh, someone who should be worshiped and revered and lifted up constantly, chose to serve as a slave. Chose to serve in a way that even your common man wouldn't. He lowered himself as low as you can possibly go. That should hurt to read. And I think the disciples really understand that, or at least Peter does. It feels wrong. It feels off to them. Because as Jesus is going through and he's washing the disciples' feet, Peter says, you're not going to do that to me. He almost kind of takes Jesus to task. What are you doing? You can't do this. You're better than this. And Jesus, he doesn't even really argue with him. In fact, later when Jesus talks about this, he's going to say, you're right, I am your master and your teacher. I am better than this. But Jesus just says, you're going to let me do this or you have no part with me. And sometimes, like I said earlier, we kind of leave the story there. We talk about the act, but the act by itself is just, it's confusing. What was Jesus really trying to tell the disciples? We understand that it's motivated by love, because that's what John told us. We understand that it has something to do with service, because we can see Jesus serving. But what does it mean? But we don't have to just guess, because Jesus tells us. If we keep reading, starting in verse 12, Jesus tells us the point of what he's doing here. When he had washed their feet and put on his outer garments and resumed his place, he said to them, "Do you understand what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example, that you also should do as I have done for you. Truly I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor a messenger greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. I am not speaking of all of you. I know whom I have chosen, but the scripture will be fulfilled. He who ate my bread has lifted his heel against me. I am telling you this now before it takes place, that when it does take place, you may believe that I am he. Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever receives the one I send receives me, and whoever receives me receives the one who sent me." So after Jesus is finished washing his disciples' feet, this slave's task, he gets up, he puts on his normal clothes, and it says he resumes his place, almost as if nothing had happened. He sits back in his rightful place. And then he looks over at the disciples and he says, "Do you guys understand what I just did?" And I'm not one to try to conjecture from the Bible a whole lot, but when I read this, I just can't help but feel that all the disciples were just sitting in stunned silence. That he asked, "Do you understand what I did?" And all he's getting are just blank stares. They don't get it. It's not right. And Jesus said, "You're not wrong. Don't miss the point. I am your Lord and your master. I am your teacher." Jesus acknowledges that was an unusual act, and yet I still humbled myself and served in this way. And it is strange, and that's the point. And he says, here's why I did it. As an example for you. I want you to go out and do what I just did. This is a pattern that my disciples must follow. The reason that Jesus did this is because he was trying to communicate as much as he possibly could. My disciples are people who go out and serve. and they have to be. Don't miss it. Jesus lays this out as a requirement of being a disciple of his. Jesus says, if you do not serve in this way, if you think that this kind of humility, this kind of service is beneath you, then what you're doing is actually trying to raise yourself above Jesus. Jesus says, if I can do this, and I did, then y'all should have absolutely no problem doing this. Jesus says, to be a disciple of mine, you have to humble yourself, and you have to serve. I fully believe that this is one of the hard sayings of Jesus. I don't think that there is any part in this section where Jesus is implying that this kind of service is easy. I don't think it is. I think it was a hard thing for Jesus to lower himself in this way. How often does Hebrews talk about what Jesus deserved and then what Jesus received? That's throughout the New Testament. Jesus deserves glory and honor. He deserves majesty and praise. And he came to this earth and he received humiliation and suffering. I don't think that's easy. And I don't think that when Jesus says, I want you to come and serve in the same way that I have served you, that he is saying that that is going to be an easy thing to do. What he's saying is, I want you to do it anyway. What he's saying is, I know you can do it because I just did. And Jesus says, you will be blessed by God if you serve in this humble manner. He says, you're going to receive life in God if you serve in this manner. The picture that Jesus is painting is this kind of service is the hard thing to do, and yet, if you want to live in the path of God's love, that is the only path. That there is no room for pride, no room for thinking that I deserve better, no room for selfishness in the way of Jesus. Because if we truly want to walk in the path of God's love, we'll understand that that means walking the way that Jesus walked. And what Jesus did is he served in this way. And I think that is further emphasized by the other thread that we haven't really talked about that has come up again and again in this chapter. You've probably been looking as we've been reading and waiting for me to say something about it because it's come up 3 times already. John starts in verses 1 through 3. He talks about Jesus knew the hour he was going to be betrayed was at hand. At the end of this serving act, Jesus makes this weird kind of cryptic statement about not all of you are clean. And he's saying that because he knows the person that he is going to be betrayed by is there in that room. And then here again, when Jesus is talking about service, he again brings up that he knows that the man that is going to betray him and lead him to death is in that room with him. Judas is in the room. He is actively plotting to betray Jesus. He is about to, in just a few verses, leave this supper and go out and betray Jesus. And I want you to think about that. Do you think that as Jesus is wearing the slave's attire and he's going through and he's washing everyone's feet, he's washing Peter and Andrew and James and John's feet, he gets to Judas, he skips over him, and then he goes right on to the next guy? That's not the way I see this going at all. John wants you to know Judas is in that room and he's plotting to kill Jesus. And Jesus knows it. And Jesus washes his feet anyway. The next thing that happens in this very chapter, Judas goes out and betrays Jesus. And it's not even just Judas. Because at the end of this chapter, Peter, the one who just said a few verses ago, I love you so much, I want as much of a part in your kingdom as I can possibly have. In verses 34 through 36, Jesus is going to tell him, you're going to betray me too. And Jesus washed Peter's feet just as much as he washed the rest of the disciples. Or if you really want to think about it, when we know what this betrayal is, when we know what Jesus is about to face on the cross, 11 out of 12 of the disciples seem to completely abandon Jesus. And Jesus washed every single one of their feet. I don't even understand it. I mean, I understand that it happened. But I don't understand how his love can be so great to do that. I have a hard time letting go of my pride enough to serve people who really do deserve it, let alone doing what Jesus did here. It goes right back to what we were talking about at the table. I'd like to think that I'd be willing to give my life for good people. I'd like to think I'd be willing to give my life for people who I think, yeah, they deserve it. Jesus is giving his life for people that he knows in just a matter of hours are going to abandon him and betray him. And that's who he's serving, and that's who he's dying for. And that's what makes verses 31 through 35, to me, the cornerstone of this whole passage. Where all these themes of love and service, they all come together. Look at starting in verse 31 with me. When Judas had gone out, Jesus said, now is the Son of Man glorified and God glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself and glorify him at once. Little children, yet a little while I am with you. You will seek me. And just as I said to the Jews, so now I also say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another just as I have loved you, you are also to love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. Notice what Jesus says here. He starts again by reminding the disciples, yes, I am glorified. Yes, God has glorified me. But notice he says, now I am glorified. Now, Jesus has deserved glory throughout his whole earthly ministry, but Jesus brings special attention to say, this is the moment where I have been glorified. And what prompts that? It's verse 31. Judas goes out to betray him, and Jesus says, now is the moment I am glorified. To me, when I think of Jesus being glorified, I think of what it talks more in Philippians 2, that after he's raised from the dead and he ascends to reign, that is glory, and that is true, but Jesus says that through this suffering that I'm about to go through, that is when I'm glorified. Jesus is glorified by being willing to suffer and die for his enemies, for people who betray him. Jesus says, I'm going away, I'm going to die, I'm going to be killed, I'm going to glorify God through my humility. I'm going to be glorified by God through my faithfulness and my selfless suffering. And that is the setting in which I have chosen to give you this, my last commandment before my death. He says, I have a new command for you, that you love each other. This is the last teaching that John records before Jesus' death. He says, this is the last thing I want to leave you with. It's a new commandment that you love each other, that you have a united love for others. But I want you to think about why that's a new commandment. That used to confuse me a lot. Jesus says, I have a new commandment for you, and it's love. Love's been all the way through the Bible. Love's been all the way through Jesus' ministry. From the very beginning, all the way in the old law, love your neighbor as yourself. That's the old covenant. Jesus says the two most important commandments when he's asked, love God and love others. Love is all over the Bible. Love is the essence of the message of Jesus. How is this new? It's because he said the new commandment is this, that you love one another just as I have loved you. Love has been the commandment from the beginning, but what Jesus has made new here is the extent to which the love is called. Jesus says, the love that you just saw when I washed your feet, that's how I want you to love others. Jesus says, the love you're about to see when I'm glorified on the cross, that's the love I want you to love others with. The new commandment is the love of Jesus is complete, it is perfect, and we have never seen anything like it before or since. It is perfect and forgiving and merciful. It is selfless and humble and patient. It is the perfect physical embodiment of the love of God. And the new commandment, the last commandment of Jesus here, is to love the way that he loves. And not only that, Jesus, if that's not enough, Jesus says that is a requirement for my disciples. He says the church will be identified, defined by their love for each other. And he says it before the world. He says before the world is going to look out, and whether they like me or not, whether they believe in me or not, whether they care about me or not, they're going to be able to see those people are different. Those people are selfless. Those people are humble. Those people would do anything for anybody. Those people go out of their way to serve at great cost. Jesus says the mark of a church of Jesus. We want to put Church of Christ on the sign. It's time to put our money where our mouth is. Jesus says if you want to be a church of Christ, what that means is to love like I did. And there's no way around it. Jesus said the world is going to look into you and they're not going to know why. They're not going to know how. But they're going to know there is something different about the way they love each other. And that means if we don't have that love as a church, if we don't have that unity, if we're not united in the love of God, we are failing our purpose as a church. Jesus people love each other. Jesus people love others. And they do it the same way that Jesus has done for them. They take the love of Jesus that is perfect and pure, and they just seek to reflect it into the world around them. That's our entire purpose. as a church. So that's John 13. Let's take just a few seconds to apply it to our lives. First, the story tells us a lot about who our God is. Our God is humble and our God is serving, and it's in ways that may make us uncomfortable sometimes, and it's ways that may not even make sense to us, but that is an aspect of who He is. That God has shown His love to us through serving at great cost. That's Jesus' purpose on earth, was to come and suffer and serve at great cost to Himself so that we may be freed by His grace. The Lord of the entire universe has served you more than you can possibly comprehend. And it is not in the natural order, and it does feel almost wrong that Jesus served as a slave, but He did it because His love is complete. We talk about all the time, God has not asked us to do anything that He would not do Himself. And that is that Jesus here is the example of that. You want to know what it's like to love your neighbor as yourself? That's a hard thing to do. Jesus does it in John 13. What about a harder thing to do? To bless those who curse you, to love your enemies. You want to know what that looks like? Looks like what Jesus did in John 13. There are many, many hard sayings of Jesus. There are many things that He has called us to do that are difficult. And there is not a single one of them that He has not already done for us. Jesus showed perfect love and through His service. And He says, my people will do the same. And so really the point that we need to walk home with is to love like Jesus loved. Jesus says, do what I just did. Jesus makes it clear. He expects His people to love like He loved in John 13. He expects His people to go out and wash feet. He expects His people to serve at great cost to themselves. He expects His people to go out of their way to show love to each other. So much so that He says, when you see that kind of love, you'll know that my truth is being preached there. When you see that kind of love, you'll know that those are my people. And so the question for us is, do I see that kind of love? Do I see that kind of love in my life? Am I showing that kind of love? Am I trying to show that kind of love to others? Do we see it in our church? Are we united in love? Are we serving each other? Do we have the love that Jesus had? We all need to grow in it. We all have to grow in it. And so I urge you, find ways to serve. Find people to serve. People who can't serve you back. Find ways to show the same love that Jesus showed. I don't know what that is for you. If you're someone who loves just sitting and talking, go visit the people that we have that are shut in nursing homes or hospitals. Many of them would love to have a visit. But if that's not your thing, there are other things you can do too. We have great card senders. We have people that are amazing at just checking up on people, giving phone calls. I'm terrible at that. I'll just admit. I'm terrible at remembering to check back up on people. But we have people here that are so good at that. whatever talent you've been given, and you already know what some of those are, what Jesus is calling you to do is use those for service of others. Because Jesus says, when you serve my people, you serve me. And when you accept my people, you accept me. Jesus says there's two paths. There's a path where you think you're too good to serve, you're too busy, you're too important, whatever it is. And that path is the path where you look at Jesus and you say, I know that's what you did, but I'm better than that. And then there's the other path, where we realize how indebted we are to Jesus, how much he has given to us. And Jesus doesn't ask a whole lot from us. Jesus just says, what I've done for you, go out and do it to other people. Pay the debt to them. So the invitation is to get on the loving path of Jesus. If you're not a Christian, you've never truly accepted that love, you can repent of your sins and be baptized and start on that loving path. For those of us who are Christians, really ask the question, am I living in the love of Jesus? And if I'm not, why not? Because it's time to get started. If you're in need of the invitation, feel free to come to the front as we stand and as we sing.